The words landed like a blade between her ribs. I never should have married you. Elsinore Vaith stood perfectly still in the center of the throne room, 200 courtiers watching, her husband's voice still ringing off the vaulted stone ceiling. The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear the candles guttering in their iron sconces 30 feet above her head. King Cale Renaud did not look at her. He sat on the obsidian throne with his back straight and his jaw carved from granite, his dark gold eyes fixed on the far wall, as though she had already ceased to exist. The woman beside him, Lady Seren Ashworth, tall and luminous and dripping in sapphires that matched the Renaud family crest, kept her gaze lowered in a performance of modesty so polished it could have been rehearsed. It probably had been. Elsinore felt the entire room holding its breath. She felt the pity rolling off the nobles in waves, thick and suffocating. She felt the satisfaction radiating from the corner where Seren's family stood, their expressions carefully neutral, but their sense sharp with triumph. She could have screamed. She could have wept. She could have dropped to her knees and begged him to take it back, to remember the nights she had spent curled against his chest listening to his heartbeat, slow into something resembling peace for the first time in his life. Instead, Elsinore smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was not a broken smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated and had finally, irrevocably, run out of patience. She reached down and twisted the gold band off her finger. The ring he had placed there himself 11 months ago in this very room, his hands trembling slightly though he would have denied it to his last breath. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger so the torchlight caught the metal, so every person in the room could see it clearly. Then she set it on the stone floor at his feet with a soft, final click that echoed louder than his words had. "As you wish, Your Majesty," she said. Her voice did not shake. Her chin did not dip. She held his gaze for exactly one breath, long enough to see something fracture behind those dark gold eyes, something he buried so fast she almost missed it. Then Elsinore Vaith turned her back on the Alpha King of Valdenmere, walked through 200 silent courtiers, and disappeared through the throne room doors. She made it 14 steps down the corridor before her knees buckled. She caught herself against the wall, one palm flat on the cold stone, and pressed her forehead against it. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. The bond in her chest, the golden thread that connected her to him whether she wanted it or not, pulled taut and screamed. She did not cry. She would not give him that. Not here, where the walls had ears and every servant answered to someone. Behind her, inside the throne room, she heard the low rumble of voices resuming. The court would be dissecting this within minutes. The herbalist queen, the nobody foundling who had somehow clawed her way onto the throne beside the most powerful alpha in the northern territories, publicly discarded in favor of a proper noblewoman. They would call it inevitable. They would call it correction. Elsinore pushed off the wall and forced her legs to carry her forward. One step, then another. The corridor stretched ahead of her, long and dim and empty. She had no title now, no chambers, no place in this castle that belonged to her. But that was not new. She had never truly belonged anywhere. What was new was the ache, deep and relentless and growing worse with every step she took away from him. The bond did not care about pride or politics or public humiliation. The bond only knew that her mate was behind her, and she was walking in the wrong direction. Elsinore kept walking. What she did not see, because she did not turn around, was Cale Renaud staring at the ring on the floor like it had stopped his heart. She did not see his hand grip the arm of the throne until the wood cracked beneath his fingers. She missed Lady Seren placing a delicate hand on his arm and the way he flinched from the contact like he had been burned. She never saw the look on his face when he finally bent down and picked up the ring. It was not relief. It was not satisfaction. It was devastation. But Elsinore was already gone. This is how it began. 11 months earlier. Elsinore had not planned to attend the harvest binding ceremony. She was not important enough to be invited, and she was not foolish enough to show up uninvited to an event where every alpha bloodline in Valdenmere would be circling each other like wolves over a kill, which was exactly what they were. But Mistress Delphara, the head healer of the Thornwall Sanctuary, had woken that morning with a fever that turned her skin the color of old parchment, and someone needed to deliver the ceremonial healing tonics to the king's hall before sundown. "You are the only one I trust not to drop them," Delphara had croaked from her sickbed, which Elsinore suspected was less a compliment and more an acknowledgement that every other apprentice was either clumsy or drunk. So here she was, standing in the doorway of the great hall of Caer Morvain, with a wooden case of crystal vials strapped across her chest, surrounded by people who smelled like old money and ancient bloodlines, trying to make herself as small as possible. The hall was enormous. Pillars of dark stone rose to a ceiling lost in shadow. Banners of deep blue and silver, the colors of House Renaud, hung from iron rods. Hundreds of candles burned in chandeliers that looked forged from the bones of something that should not have existed. And at the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais, sat the Alpha King. Every child in Valdenmere had grown up hearing stories about Cael Renaud, the youngest king in 3 centuries, the wolf who had ended the Ashen March rebellion by walking alone into the enemy camp and emerging 3 hours later having ended the rebellion single-handedly. The ruler whose dominance aura was so overwhelming that lesser wolves could not remain standing in his presence. Looking at him now, she believed every word. He was massive, built like something designed for violence, and then reluctantly pressed into a throne. His dark gold eyes surveyed the room without warmth. He looked bored. He looked dangerous. He looked like he had not slept in a very long time. Elsinore tore her gaze away and focused on finding Counselor Halvard, the man she was supposed to deliver the tonics to. She spotted him near the east wall, deep in conversation with a woman in emerald silk. She adjusted the case on her chest and began threading through the crowd. She made it halfway across the hall before the trouble started. A servant carrying a tray of wine goblets stumbled. Whether he tripped on his own feet or someone's outstretched boot, Elsinore never knew. What she knew was that the tray pitched sideways. 6 goblets of deep red wine arced through the air in horrifying slow motion, and 4 of them landed directly on Lady Seren Ashworth. The scream that followed could have shattered glass. Elsinore froze. Every head in the hall turned. Lady Seren stood drenched in crimson wine, her ivory gown ruined beyond salvation, her expression cycling through shock and fury at a speed that was almost impressive. "You clumsy fool!" Lady Seren hissed at the servant, who had gone white as bone. "Do you have any idea what this gown cost? Do you have any idea who I am?" The servant dropped to his knees, stammering apologies. Elsinore watched the scene with the resigned understanding of someone who had grown up surrounded by powerful people and knew exactly how this would end. The servant would be punished. Lady Seren would be soothed. The evening would continue. But then Seren's hand came up, and Elsinore saw the strike coming before it landed. She moved without thinking. Years of healer training had wired her body to respond to the anticipation of harm before her conscious mind caught up. She stepped between them, caught Seren's wrist mid-swing and held it. The hall went silent. Lady Seren stared at her. Elsinore stared back. She was acutely aware that she was a nobody apprentice healer who had just laid hands on one of the most powerful noblewomen in the kingdom, and that this was almost certainly going to result in her death. "Let go of me," Seren said, her voice low and lethally calm. Elsinore released her wrist and stepped back. "Forgive me, my lady. I thought you were about to fall." The lie was so transparent it was almost an insult. Seren's eyes narrowed. "You thought I was about to fall," she repeated. "The wine," Elsinore said, gesturing at the floor. "The floor is slippery. It would be easy to lose your balance." Silence stretched across the hall like a held breath. Every wolf in the room could smell the lie. Every wolf could also smell the fear pouring off the servant and the cold fury radiating from Seren, and something else beneath it all. Amusement from the dais, from the king. Seren smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "How thoughtful," she said, and turned away. The moment broke. Conversations resumed. The servant scrambled to his feet and vanished into the crowd. Elsinore stood there with her heart trying to beat its way out of her throat and her hands shaking so badly the vials in her case clinked against each other. "That," said a voice behind her, low and dry and laced with something she could not identify, was either very brave or very reckless. Elsinore turned and found herself looking directly at the chest of the Alpha King. She had not heard him move. She had not felt him approach. He had crossed the entire length of the hall in silence, and now he was standing 3 feet away, and her lungs simply stopped working. She looked up. The dark gold eyes that met hers were not bored anymore. They were sharp, focused, studying her with an intensity that made the fine hairs on her arms rise. "Both, Your Majesty," Elsinore managed, usually at the same time. Something shifted in his expression, not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one, flickering across his features like light through water before it disappeared. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Then his nostrils flared slightly and something changed in his eyes. Something she could not name and would spend weeks trying to understand. He turned away without another word and walked back to the dais. Elsinore delivered the tonics to Counselor Halvard with hands that would not stop trembling and fled the hall as fast as her legs would carry her. She did not look back at the king. She could not afford to. Because for those 3 seconds, when his eyes had locked on hers, something in her chest had pulled tight, like a string being plucked on an instrument she did not know she carried. And her wolf, silent her entire life, had opened its eyes. 3 days passed. Elsinore convinced herself the encounter in the Great Hall meant nothing. Kings did not remember the faces of nobody herbalists. She had intervened, she had been foolish, and now it was over. Then Counselor Halvard appeared at the sanctuary door. "The king requests your presence at Kaer Morvain," he said, like this was a perfectly normal sentence. "He would like your professional opinion on a matter of health." Elsinore stared at him. "My professional opinion," she repeated. "You are a healer, are you not?" "An apprentice healer. Mistress Delphara is the head healer. She is the one who should be consulted." Halvard glanced at Delphara, who was still in bed with a fever that had stubbornly refused to break. "Mistress Delphara is indisposed. You will do." "You will do" was not exactly the ringing endorsement Elsinore had hoped for, but it came attached to a royal summons, which was not the sort of thing one declined without an exceptionally good reason or a death wish. She followed Halvard through the castle gates and into the private wing, each step taking her further from the parts of Kaer Morvain she knew, and deeper into corridors that smelled of cedar and iron and power. The guards at every doorway tracked her with flat, assessing eyes. Halvard stopped at a door reinforced with iron bands. "The king has been experiencing difficulty sleeping," he said, "for some time." Elsinore waited for more. There was no more. "How long is some time?" she asked. 14 months. Elsinore blinked. 14 months without sleep? That would kill a normal man. "He is not a normal man," Halvard replied. "He is the Alpha King and the strongest shifter born in 7 generations. That has kept him alive. But his physicians fear he is approaching a threshold." "A threshold," Elsinore repeated carefully. "You mean he is dying?" Halvard's expression did not change. "I mean the king requests your professional opinion." He opened the door. The king's study was large, cold, and severe. Stone walls, narrow windows, a fire burning low in a massive hearth that did little to warm the room. Maps and reports covered every surface. And behind a desk piled with correspondence sat Cale Renaud, his pen moving across a document with the focused precision of a man who had weaponized productivity as a substitute for rest. He did not look up when she entered. Elsinore stood just inside the doorway and tried to breathe normally. The last time she had been this close to him, he had been standing. Now he was seated, and somehow his presence was even more suffocating. It filled the room like heat from a forge, pressing against her skin, making the air thick. "Your Majesty," she said, "Counselor Halvard mentioned you have been having trouble sleeping." "Did he?" Kale said, still writing. "He did, Your Majesty. For 14 months, he said." The pen paused. "Halvard talks too much." "Healers tend to appreciate thorough information, Your Majesty. It helps us not accidentally kill our patients." The pen stopped entirely. He looked up, and those dark gold eyes pinned her in place. "You are the one from the ceremony," he said. "The one who stopped Lady Seren." "I stopped her from falling, Your Majesty." "You stopped her from striking a servant." Elsinore said nothing. The corner of his mouth twitched, barely perceptible. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elsinore Vaith, Your Majesty." "Vaith?" He frowned slightly. "I do not know that family." "There is no family, Your Majesty. I was left at the sanctuary as an infant. Delphara gave me the name." Something flickered across his face, too fast to read. He set down the pen and leaned back in his chair. The movement should have made him look relaxed. It did not. He looked like a predator settling into a crouch. 14 months, he said. "I have not managed more than a handful of minutes of rest in all that time. Every healer in the kingdom has tried and failed. What makes Halvard think you will be different?" "I have no idea, Your Majesty. I am an apprentice. I treat burns, fevers, and the occasional poorly set bone. I have never treated insomnia in an Alpha King." "At least you are honest," he said. "Delphara says honesty is the only medicine that does not expire." That ghost of a smile again, there and gone. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Tell me what you would recommend." Elsinore sat. She asked him questions, clinical and precise. When did the sleeplessness begin? Had he tried valerian, passion flower, moonbloom extract? What happened when he closed his eyes? He answered with controlled economy. Yes, there had been a triggering event. The Ashen March Rebellion. No, the herbs had not worked. What happened when he closed his eyes was not something he wished to discuss. As he spoke, Elsinore watched him carefully. She noticed the shadows carved beneath his eyes, so deep they looked like bruises. She noticed the hollows in his cheeks that should not exist on a man fed by the royal kitchens. She noticed the way his hands, steady when they held a pen, developed a fine tremor when they were idle. He was deteriorating, slowly but unmistakably. The strongest wolf in 7 generations was being eaten alive from the inside. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "I would like to examine you, with your permission." His eyes narrowed. "Examine me how? Your pulse, your breathing, your scent markers?" Standard diagnostic for a healer. He hesitated, then extended his wrist across the desk. Elsinore placed her fingers against his pulse point. His skin was hot, far hotter than normal. She could feel the rapid, irregular rhythm of his heart beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes and focused on the scent markers. Cortisol saturating his system. Adrenaline spiking in waves. And beneath it all, something dark and foreign, coiled around his natural scent like a vine strangling a tree. She opened her eyes and found him watching her. Something had changed in his face. The hard lines had softened. His eyelids had grown heavy. "Your Majesty?" she said. He blinked, and the softness vanished. He pulled his wrist back. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice rougher than before. "Something I need to research before I can give you an answer," Elsinore said. "Something wrong. Something that does not belong." His jaw tightened. "You are not the first healer to say that." "Perhaps not. But I may be the first one stubborn enough to figure out what it is." He studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze and did not flinch, though every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to lower her eyes and submit. "You have 1 week," he said. "Report to Halvard with your findings." Elsinore stood, bowed, and walked toward the door. She was 3 steps from the threshold when his voice stopped her. "Vaith," she turned. "Your Majesty?" He was looking at her with an expression she could not decipher. "When you touched me," he said slowly, "for a moment, the noise stopped." Her breath caught. "The noise, Your Majesty?" "The thing that keeps me awake," he said. For a moment, it went quiet. He said it like a man confessing something dangerous, like the admission itself was a weapon he was handing her, and he was not entirely sure she would not use it against him. Elsinore stood very still. "Then perhaps we should find out why," she said softly. She left the study with her heart hammering. She made it to the end of the corridor before Halvard appeared beside her. "You felt it," he said. Not a question. "Felt what?" "Whatever it is about you that makes the noise stop." He paused. "I have been listening to that man suffer for 14 months. Tonight, for the first time, his heart rate dropped while someone was in the room with him." "What did you do?" "I touched his wrist," Elsinore said. "That is all." The silence that followed was too heavy, too full of meaning she was not ready to unpack. "Come back tomorrow," Halvard said. "Spend time in his presence. I want to see if it happens again." "And if it does?" Elsinore asked. Halvard looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something behind his composure that looked like desperate, fragile hope. "Then you do not leave," he said. Elsinore returned the next morning and every morning after that. Halvard arranged it quietly. She was given a chair in the corner of the king's study, a small desk of her own, and a stack of herbal texts to justify her presence. Officially, she was conducting research into a rare sleep disorder on behalf of the sanctuary. Unofficially, she was sitting in a room with the Alpha King and waiting for something impossible to happen again. It happened on the second day. Kale was reviewing border reports with 2 of his generals when his pen slowed. His writing, usually sharp and precise, turned sluggish. His eyelids drooped. One of the generals was mid-sentence about northern patrol routes when the king's head dipped forward, caught itself, then dipped again. The generals exchanged a glance. Kale's eyes closed. His breathing deepened. His hand went slack against the desk, and the pen rolled across the parchment, leaving a thin line of ink that trailed off the edge like a signature no one had asked for. He was asleep. Elsinore sat frozen in her chair. The generals stared at the king, then at her, then back at the king. One of them opened his mouth to speak. "Do not wake him," Halvard said from the doorway, his voice barely above a whisper. No one had heard him arrive. Everyone out, quietly. The generals left. Halvard remained, watching the king sleep with an expression that Elsinore could only describe as stunned relief. "How long has it been since he slept like that?" she whispered. "In front of anyone?" "Never." Halvard's gaze moved to her. "In general? Months. Perhaps longer." 26 minutes passed before Kale stirred. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused, and for a single unguarded moment he looked young. Not like a king, not like a killer. Like a man who had simply been very, very tired. Then his gaze sharpened. Found Halvard, found the empty chairs where his generals had been, and the mask slammed back into place. "What happened?" he asked. "You rested, Your Majesty," Halvard said calmly. Kale's jaw tightened. He looked at Elsinore. She expected anger, embarrassment, the cold fury of a man whose weakness had been witnessed. Instead, she saw something raw and desperate flash through his eyes before he could suppress it. Hope. It vanished as fast as it appeared, buried beneath control so practiced it was nearly seamless. But she had seen it, and it broke something in her chest she did not know could be broken. "Continue your research, Miss Vaith," the king said, his voice neutral. "Same arrangement tomorrow." A rhythm formed over the following weeks. Elsinore arrived each morning and settled into her corner. She worked in silence while Cale conducted the business of the kingdom. She learned his habits without meaning to. The way he rubbed the bridge of his nose when frustrated. The way his handwriting grew larger when tired. The way he drank his tea in 3 precise sips. Never more, never less. She learned that he was not cold, he was contained. There was a difference. The sleep came easier each day. 20 minutes became 40. 40 became an hour. His body, starved for rest, surrendered more willingly each time she was near. He never acknowledged it directly, but the changes accumulated like snow on a windowsill. A second chair appeared at his desk, angled toward hers, closing the distance between them by half. A pot of tea began arriving each morning with 2 cups instead of 1. A fur blanket was draped over the back of her chair on the first cold morning of the season, and when she looked at him, he was studying a map with an intensity that suggested cartography had never been more fascinating. "Thank you for the blanket," she said. "What blanket?" he asked without looking up. Elsinore bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. "The one that materialized on my chair overnight. The very expensive one lined with silver fox." "I have no knowledge of any blanket." "Of course not, Your Majesty." She could have sworn the tips of his ears went red. One evening, late, when the fire had burned low and the castle had gone quiet, Cale spoke into the silence. "Why did you stop her?" Elsinore looked up from her notes. "Stop whom?" "Lady Seren, at the ceremony. You could have looked away. Everyone else did." Elsinore set her pen down. "Because no one should be struck for spilling wine. It was an accident. You risked the wrath of one of the most powerful families in the kingdom for a servant you did not know." "He was frightened," Elsinore said simply. "And she was going to hurt him. The calculation was not complicated." Cale studied her. The firelight carved deep shadows across his face, but his eyes were bright. "Most people find that calculation very complicated when power is involved," he said. "Most people are not raised by Delphara," Elsinore replied. "She would have boxed my ears if I had stood there and watched." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Warmer than a smile. A softening around the eyes that made her breath catch. "Delphara sounds formidable," he said. "She once threw a bedpan at a duke who refused to let her examine his wound. He was dripping all over her clean floor. She told him rank did not excuse foolishness." Cale laughed. It was quiet and brief and rough at the edges, like laughter that had not been used in a long time and was not entirely sure how to work anymore. But it was real, and the sound of it landed somewhere deep behind her ribs. She smiled at him. He looked away first, clearing his throat, but the softness did not leave his face entirely. That night, after she had gone, Halvard found the king still sitting at his desk, staring at the chair where she had been. "Your Majesty," the counselor said carefully. "It has been nearly a month. The pattern is undeniable. She is the reason you sleep." "I am aware," Cale said. "Her presence alone is not sustainable. The distance between the sanctuary and the castle, the daily travel, the strain on her other duties. We need to consider a more permanent arrangement." Cale said nothing for a long time. Then, "What are you proposing?" Halvard met his gaze steadily. "I am proposing she live here, in the castle, close to you." "Close to me," Cale repeated, his voice flat. "For your health, Your Majesty." The silence stretched. Then the king picked up his pen and returned to his report. "Arrange it," he said, without inflection. Halvard turned to leave. "Halvard." The counselor paused. "She gets a proper room. Not a servant's quarters. A proper room with a window and a door that locks from the inside." Something moved behind Halvard's composed expression. "Of course, Your Majesty." Elsinore moved into Caer Morvain on a gray morning that smelled of rain and cedar smoke. Her entire life fit into 2 canvas bags: her herbs, her books, her mortar and pestle, and 3 dresses that had seen better decades. A guard led her to her new quarters, which turned out to be a room larger than the entire sleeping hall at the sanctuary, with a window overlooking the castle's inner courtyard and a door that locked from the inside. She stood in the middle of her new quarters and tried not to cry. She had never had a room of her own. The arrangement, as Halvard explained it, was straightforward. She would work in the castle's healing ward during the day, treating the usual parade of injuries and ailments. In the evenings, she would sit with the king during his final hours of work. The proximity would allow him to sleep. Simple, clinical, entirely devoid of complication. It lasted about 3 days before it became very complicated. The problem was the nighttime. Elsinore talked. It was what she did when she was nervous. And she was spectacularly nervous. She told him about her patients at the ward, the soldier with the dislocated shoulder who had wept when she set it back, and then immediately asked if she thought it made him look tough. She told him about the kitchen boy who had accidentally eaten a paste meant for treating saddle sores and spent 2 hours convinced he was dying. She told him about the young healer who had once mixed up 2 nearly identical powders and turned a nobleman's bathwater bright orange. "Was that also you?" Cale asked. I plead healer's privilege and refused to answer. He almost smiled. She could see it fighting to break through, and it filled her with a ridiculous, disproportionate sense of triumph. He fell asleep more easily in the evenings. The transition from wakefulness to sleep softened, became less like a man being dragged under and more like someone choosing to let go. She could track the exact moment it happened. His shoulders would ease first, then his jaw, then his hands. His breathing would slow from the controlled, deliberate rhythm of a man holding himself together into something unguarded and deep. She would sit in her chair and watch him sleep at his desk, and she would feel something she had no right to feel. Tenderness. One night she woke to a sound. She had fallen asleep in her chair. The fire had died to embers. The study was dark except for a thin stripe of moonlight through the narrow window, and the sound came again. Low, guttural, wrenched from somewhere deep. Cale was still at his desk, his head resting on his folded arms. But he was not sleeping peacefully. His body was rigid, his hands clenched into fists, his face twisted in an expression she had never seen on him before. Agony. She was on her feet before she made the decision to stand. She crossed to his side and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Your Majesty," she said, "wake up." His hand seized her wrist. His eyes flew open, but they were not seeing her. They were seeing something else, somewhere else, and the grip on her wrist was iron. Then her vision split. One moment she was in the study, her hand on his shoulder. The next, she was somewhere cold and dark and vast, standing on ground that felt wrong beneath her bare feet. The sky above her was not a sky. It was a ceiling of swirling black cloud. The air tasted of iron and grief. And all around her, rising from the dark earth like monuments, were stones. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Rough-hewn and unmarked, stretching in every direction, a field of graves, and in the center of it, kneeling with his hands pressed flat against the cold earth, was Cale. He was different here. Smaller. The authority stripped away, the control peeled back, the mask shattered. What remained was a man drowning in guilt so heavy it had calcified into landscape. "Cale," she called out. Her voice was swallowed by the silence. He did not hear her, did not move, did not react. She walked toward him, each step harder than the last, as though the ground itself was trying to hold her back. When she reached him, she crouched down and touched his face. "Come back," she whispered. "This is not real." His eyes found hers. For a moment, she saw recognition. Then the ground beneath them shifted, and the graves began to open. Hands broke through the soil. Faces. Not rotting, not skeletal, but whole and terribly calm. Warriors in tattered armor. Civilians with wounds that would never close. Children. A chill tore through her. "They were in the settlement," Cale said, his voice hollow. When I ordered the assault. I did not know they were there. These are the dead from the Ashen March, Elsinore breathed. Every night, he said. Every night they come. The nearest figure, a woman clutching a bundle to her chest, opened her mouth and spoke. You knew, she said, her voice layered with echoes. You knew, and you came anyway. I did not know, Cale said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Only rehearsed exhaustion, the hollow repetition of someone who had fought this accusation 1,000 times and no longer believed his own defense. Elsinore seized his wrist and wrenched. She did not know how she knew it would work. She did not know why the dream obeyed her when nothing else in this place seemed to follow any logic. But the moment her fingers closed around his, the world fractured. She gasped awake. She was kneeling beside his chair in the study, her hand still gripping his. The fire was dead. The room was freezing. And Cale was staring at her with an expression of absolute horror. Not at what he had seen in the dream. At her. You were there, he said. His voice was ragged. You saw? Yes, she whispered. The silence between them was so fragile she could feel it cracking. You saw the children, he said. Yes. His hand pulled free from hers. He stood abruptly, knocking the chair back, and crossed to the window. He pressed his forehead against the glass and did not speak. Cale, she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without his title. The word felt dangerous in her mouth. Intimate. He flinched like she had struck him. You should not have seen that, he said. No one should see that. How long has this been happening? She demanded. Every night? For 14 months? He did not answer. This is not insomnia, Elsinore said. Something was done to you. Go to bed, Miss Vaith. Not until you tell me what this is. He turned from the window, his eyes red, his face wrecked. It is a curse, he said. Laid by the witch Morrigan Ashenmarch when I defeated her son. She spoke words I did not understand, and every night since, I go to that place, and the dead remind me of what I have done. Elsinore stared at him. You have known this entire time? What would telling have changed? Everything, she snapped. Curses can be broken. Curses have rules, structures, weaknesses. You have been suffering in silence for over a year because you decided on your own that it was hopeless? His jaw clenched. It is my burden. It is killing you. The words hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Go to bed, Miss Vaith, he repeated, quieter now. Elsinore stood her ground for 5 more seconds. Then she turned and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the latch. I am going to find a way to break it, she said without turning around. Whether you want me to or not. She did not wait for his response. Elsinore threw herself into research with a ferocity that startled even Delphara, who had traveled to the castle at Halvard's request once her fever finally broke. The 2 healers commandeered a corner of the castle library and buried themselves in texts on curse magic, binding oaths, and dream prisons. The structure is old, Delphara said. Pre-covenant magic. Morrigan Ashenmarch was drawing on practices that predate the modern pacts by centuries. Can it be broken? Elsinore asked. Everything built can be unbuilt. But the mechanism matters. If the curse feeds on something external, you cut the supply. If it feeds on something internal, then the cursed person has to stop feeding it. Elsinore leaned back in her chair and pressed her hands against her eyes. He blames himself, she said. For all of them. The soldiers, the civilians, the children. Delphara was quiet for a moment. Does he have reason to? He ordered the assault on the Ashenmarch settlement. He believed it was a military outpost. It was not. There were families inside. Elsinore's voice cracked. He carries every single death like a personal failure. And the curse uses that, Delphara said. Like fuel, Elsinore confirmed. Every night, it forces him to relive it. The guilt feeds the magic, and the magic feeds the guilt, and the cycle never breaks because he believes he deserves it. Delphara removed her spectacles and rubbed her eyes. Then the cure is not herbal, child. It never was. Elsinore knew she was right. She also knew that telling Cale Renaud to forgive himself was about as productive as telling the ocean to stop being wet. In the meantime, the evenings continued. Halvard suggested that Elsinore sit closer to the king. Something about proximity and scent, and measurable improvements in his resting heart rate. So her chair migrated from the corner of the study to the side of his desk, and then from the side of his desk to the space beside his chair, until their elbows nearly touched when they both reached for their tea at the same time. She became achingly aware of him, the warmth radiating from his body, his scent, cedar and iron and something purely his, something that made her wolf press forward with an urgency that frightened her. The way his hand sometimes drifted toward hers on the desk and then stopped, fingers curling back like he had caught himself reaching for something forbidden. One night, his hand did not stop. She was reading aloud from a text on binding magic, her voice low and steady in the quiet room when his fingers brushed against hers on the desk. The contact was featherlight. Accidental, she told herself. But his fingers did not pull away. They stayed, barely touching hers, and the warmth of that contact spread up her arm and settled in her chest like embers catching fire. She kept reading. Her voice did not falter, but her heart was hammering so hard she was sure the sound filled the room. When she finished the passage and looked up, his eyes were closed. His breathing was deep and even. He was asleep with his fingertips resting against hers, and his face was peaceful in a way she had never seen it during waking hours. She did not move her hand. She sat beside him in the dying firelight and watched him sleep, and felt the pull in her chest grow stronger. She knew what it was now. She had known for weeks, though she had not dared to name it. The constant awareness, the ache when they were apart. The way her wolf stirred every time he entered a room. A fated bond, forming slowly, stubbornly, inevitably, between a nobody foundling and the alpha king. She should tell him. She should tell Halvard. She should tell Delphara. Instead, she sat there in the dark, her fingers touching his, and let herself have this one small thing for just a little longer. In the morning, Cale acted as though nothing had happened. His mask was firmly in place, his voice clipped and professional. But when she arrived at the study that afternoon, there was a second blanket on her chair and a small glass jar of wildflowers on her desk that had not been there the day before. "Pretty," Elsinore said, touching the petals. "What is?" Cale asked, not looking up from his correspondence. Elsinore bit back a smile so wide it made her face ache. "Nothing, Your Majesty." Then Lady Seren Ashworth arrived at Caer Morvain with a retinue of 40, a wardrobe that required its own carriage, and a smile that could cut glass. Halvard delivered the news to Elsinore that evening as she prepared for her session with the king. "The Ashworth family has petitioned for an audience," he said. "Lady Seren seeks a formal courtship with His Majesty." Elsinore's hand stopped moving. "A courtship. It is politically advantageous. The Ashworth lands border the Northern Territories. An alliance would secure the border and silence the factions who believe the king should have taken a mate by now." "A mate," Elsinore repeated, and the word tasted like ash. Halvard watched her carefully. "The king has not accepted. He has agreed only to hear the petition." "Of course," Elsinore said, her voice bright and brittle. "It is none of my concern." "Miss Vaith," Halvard began, "I should go. The king will be waiting." She walked to the study on legs that felt wooden and numb. The bond in her chest, the one she had not told anyone about, pulled taut and ached. Of course there would be a courtship. Of course there would be a proper match. She was a foundling with no family, no name, no bloodline. Kings did not mate with women like her. Whatever was forming between them, the touches, the laughter, the flowers she was not supposed to notice, was not for her to keep. It never had been. She arrived at the study and took her seat. Cale glanced up from his desk. Whatever he saw in her face made him pause. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No, Your Majesty." She opened her book. The words blurred. "I hear you have a visitor." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The Ashworth petition. You heard." Halvard mentioned it. Silence. Then, "It is a political matter. Nothing more." Elsinore forced a smile. "You do not owe me an explanation, Your Majesty. These are matters of state. I am simply here for your health." The words came out exactly as she intended, light and professional and completely detached. She watched them land and watched something dim behind his eyes. "Yes," he said, after a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long. "Of course." They sat in silence for the rest of the evening. He did not fall asleep. His hand did not reach for hers. And when she finally excused herself and walked back to her room, the bond in her chest throbbed with a pain she could not name. She pressed her back against her bedroom door and slid to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She would not cry over the Alpha King. She would not. She cried. Elsinore did what she always did when the world became unbearable. She worked. She buried herself in the healing ward during the days and assisted Delphara with curse research in the afternoons. In the evenings, she sat in the king's study and did her job. She did not talk. She did not tell stories. She did not reach for his hand. Cale noticed immediately. "You are quiet," he said on the second evening. "I am reading, Your Majesty." "You are never this quiet." "Perhaps I have run out of stories about apprentices who accidentally dye things the wrong color." He studied her. She kept her eyes on the page and her expression carefully neutral, and her heart locked behind a wall she was building brick by brick, because if she let it slip, if she let even one crack show, the bond would pour through it and she would say things she had no right to say to a man who was about to court another woman. Seren's presence in the castle was impossible to ignore. She appeared at meals, at court functions, at the king's side during formal audiences, perfectly suited to the role of queen in every way that Elsinore was not. And Seren was kind to Elsinore. That was the worst part. She sought Elsinore out in the healing ward one afternoon, praised the king's improvement, called her work admirable. Her smile was warm, genuine even, and her eyes, beneath the gentleness, were sharper than anyone gave her credit for. Elsinore stood alone after she left, gripping the examination table until her knuckles turned white. 3 weeks into the courtship, Cale stopped sleeping. It happened gradually. The first night he simply could not settle. His breathing stayed shallow, his body stayed rigid, and when Elsinore finally excused herself at midnight, he was still awake, staring at the fire. The second night was worse. The third, he did not even try. Elsinore felt it through the bond. His body was consuming itself again. The shadows under his eyes deepened. His temper shortened. He snapped at Halvard during a meeting and sat in rigid silence for an hour afterward. He was deteriorating, and she could not stop it because the bond, the connection that linked her heartbeat to his, was the very thing she was trying to suffocate. Delphara cornered her in the library. "You are killing yourself," the old healer said bluntly, "and you are killing him." "I am not doing anything." "Precisely. You are withdrawing from a forming bond. Do you have any idea what that does to both parties?" "The bond does not matter," Elsinore said, and the words scraped her throat raw. "He is courting Seren. I am a foundling with no name, and whatever I feel is irrelevant." Delphara sat down heavily. "Child, I have watched you grow from a squalling infant on my doorstep into a woman who would walk into a king's nightmare and drag him out by the hand. Do not tell me what you feel is irrelevant." Elsinore's eyes burned. She blinked hard. "He does not want me, Delphara. Not like that. I am a remedy, a treatment, and treatments end." "You are a fool," Delphara said, with the tender exasperation of someone who had raised one. "And so is he." The breaking point came on a Thursday. Elsinore was in the healing ward, treating a guardsman's dislocated finger when the world tilted sideways. The pain hit first, a searing bolt through her chest that had nothing to do with her own body. She gasped, stumbled, caught herself on the edge of the table. Then the pull, violent, desperate, dragging her toward the east wing of the castle with a force that made her vision white out at the edges. Something was wrong with Kale. She ran, through the corridors, up the stairs, past guards who shouted after her. She burst through the study door and found him on the floor. He had collapsed. His body was rigid, his back arched off the stone, his eyes unseeing. Halvard was on his knees beside him, helpless. Elsinore dropped beside him and grabbed his face. "Kale," she said. "Kale, come back." He did not respond. She could feel the curse through the bond now, a living thing, a parasite that had sunk its roots so deep into him it had become indistinguishable from his own guilt. It was pulling him under, pulling him into the graveyard. And this time, it did not intend to let him surface. She pressed her forehead against his and closed her eyes. The graveyard materialized around her. The black sky, the endless rows of unmarked stones. But it was different now. The space was collapsing, shrinking, tightening around him like a fist. Kale was at the center, and he was not kneeling anymore. He was lying down, his body pressed flat against the cold earth, his eyes open and staring at the black sky above him. The dead surrounded him in a circle, standing motionless, watching, waiting. And at the edge of the circle, seated on a stone, was a woman, old, bone-thin, white hair in matted ropes, eyes milky and vacant. But her mouth curved in a smile that made every nerve in Elsinore's body scream. Morrigan Ashenmarch. "He is almost done," the witch said, her voice a dry rasp that came from everywhere and nowhere. "He has nearly finished paying." "He owes you nothing," Elsinore spat. Morrigan's head tilted. "You, the one who smells of green things and stubbornness. I wondered when you would come." "Let him go." The witch laughed. It was a terrible sound. "I am not holding him, child. He is holding himself. He has been holding himself here since the night my son fell. All I did was build the room. He furnished it with his own guilt." Elsinore looked at Kale, lying motionless among the graves, and felt the truth of it like a blade. "This curse should have faded months ago," Morrigan continued. "The magic was not strong enough to last. But he feeds it. Every night, he pours his guilt into these stones and makes them real. He believes he deserves this. And belief, child, is the strongest magic there is." Elsinore knelt beside Kale and took his hand. It was cold, lifeless. The bond between them flickered like a candle in a storm. "I cannot reach him," she whispered, horror creeping into her voice. "He has gone too deep." "Then perhaps it is time to stop reaching," Morrigan said. "Perhaps it is time to let him go." Elsinore's head snapped up. "No. He chose this. He chooses it every night. You cannot save someone who believes they deserve to drown." "Watch me," Elsinore said. She turned back to Kale. She lay down beside him on the cold, dead ground, pressed her body against his, and wrapped her arms around him. The dead watched in silence. Morrigan watched with those empty, milky eyes. "I know you can hear me," Elsinore whispered against his ear. "I know you are in there, and I know you think you deserve this, but you are wrong." No response. His body was cold. His breathing was barely there. "You went to war because people were dying and no one else would stop it. You made impossible choices because that is what kings do. And yes, people died. Children died. And that is a wound that will never fully heal. And I am not going to stand here and tell you it should." She felt tears on her face, felt them fall onto his skin and disappear into the dead earth. "But you have been paying for 14 months. You have given this place your sleep, your health, your sanity. You have given it everything, and it is still not enough because it will never be enough. The debt you are trying to pay does not exist, Kale. It was invented by grief and sealed by a curse, and you have been keeping it alive with your own guilt long after the magic should have faded. She tightened her arms around him. You are allowed to put this down. You are allowed to grieve without drowning, and you are allowed to live. Her voice broke. Please, live, because I cannot do this without you, and I know you are courting someone else, and I know I am nobody, but I love you. And if you die in this place, I will die too, so please, please, wake up. Silence. Then his hand moved. His fingers closed around hers, weak and trembling but there. You are not nobody, Cale said, his voice cracked and raw. You have never been nobody. The dead began to dissolve. One by one, like smoke in wind, they turned away from the circle and faded into the dark. The stones sank into the earth. The black sky cracked, and through the fractures, light poured in, warm and golden and blinding. Morrigan watched from her stone. Her expression was unreadable. The debt, she said softly, is paid. She dissolved with the rest. Elsinore gasped awake on the study floor, Cale's hand gripping hers, his body shaking, his eyes open and clear, and looking at her with an expression that contained so many things at once she could not separate them. Grief, relief, gratitude, and something else. Something that made the bond in her chest flare so bright it burned. You came for me, he said. I will always come for you, she replied. He pulled her against his chest and held her so tightly she could feel his heartbeat slamming against her ribs. She held him back. She did not let go. Halvard stood by the door, tears running silently down his weathered face. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The curse broke. Not all at once, not cleanly, but the structure of it collapsed that night like a building whose foundation had finally been pulled free. Cale slept for 14 hours straight. When he woke, the shadows under his eyes were still there, but something behind them had changed. A light that had been extinguished for over a year had flickered back on. Elsinore was sitting beside his bed when he opened his eyes. You look terrible, she said. You are crying, he observed. I am not crying. I have allergies. To what? To kings who almost die in cursed graveyard dimensions. The corner of his mouth lifted. It was small and fragile, and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Then his expression sobered. He sat up slowly, and she could see the weight of what he needed to say settling on his shoulders. The courtship with Sirene, he said. Elsinore's stomach plummeted. You do not need to explain. Yes, I do. He met her eyes. I pursued the courtship because I believed it was the responsible thing to do, for the kingdom, for the alliance, and because I believed that what I felt for you was a complication I had no right to act on. Elsinore's breath caught. A complication. You were my healer. You were under my protection. You had no choice in this arrangement, and any advance from me would have been an abuse of the power I held over your circumstances. I could not be certain you were not simply performing a duty. Performing a duty, Elsinore repeated, her voice rising. You thought I sat beside you every night for months, followed you into a cursed nightmare, and told you I loved you on the floor of a supernatural graveyard because I was performing a duty? When you say it like that, it does sound idiotic. It is idiotic. I am aware. She stared at him. He stared back. The bond between them hummed. I am ending the courtship, Cale said. Today. Because of the bond? Elsinore asked carefully. Because of you. His voice dropped. Because you are the first person in my life who has ever looked at the worst thing I have done and not turned away. Because you dragged me out of a place I had resigned myself to dying in. Because when I wake up and you are not there, the world feels wrong in a way that has nothing to do with curses. He reached for her hand. His hand closed over hers, rough and warm and sure. And because I am in love with you, he said, inconveniently, hopelessly and completely, and I have been since the night you told me about Delphara throwing a bedpan at a duke." Elsinore laughed. It came out wet and shaky and not at all dignified, and she did not care. "That is a terrible moment to fall in love with someone," she said. "I am aware of that as well." She kissed him. She leaned across the bed and kissed him, and he responded immediately, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, pulling her closer. The kiss was soft and desperate, and tasted like salt from her tears and something sweet beneath it. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. "I should warn you," he murmured. "Ending the courtship will make enemies of the Ashworth family. They will not accept this gracefully." "I once caught Lady Seren's wrist in front of 200 people," Elsinore replied. "I do not think graceful is something she associates with me regardless." He laughed, low and quiet and real. Then his expression shifted, turned serious and open and vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. "Marry me," he said. It was no royal decree, no command. It was a question, asked by a man who had spent 14 months in a graveyard of his own making and had been pulled out by a woman with no bloodline and no title and absolutely no sense of self-preservation. "Yes," Elsinore said. "Obviously, yes." The wedding was small by royal standards. Seren and her family departed Caer Morvain the morning of the announcement, their carriages loaded with silent fury. Halvard handled the political fallout with the serene efficiency of someone who had been managing crises since before Elsinore was born. Cale placed the ring on her finger himself. His hands did not tremble this time. The months that followed were not easy. The nightmares did not vanish entirely. Some nights Cale woke gasping, the echoes of the graveyard clinging to his skin. But Elsinore was there. She held him, talked him back, pressed her hand against his chest until his heartbeat steadied. He began talking about the war, not all at once, in fragments, over late nights by the fire, the decisions he had made, the ones he regretted. "You do not have to carry them alone," Elsinore told him. "I know," he said. "That is the part I am still learning." The court adjusted, slowly, reluctantly, the way courts always do. The foundling queen was an oddity, a scandal, a curiosity. She had no family name, no bloodline, no training in diplomacy or statecraft. But she had the king's ear and his heart and his unwavering, slightly terrifying devotion, and that, as Halvard noted dryly, tended to settle most arguments. And then, 11 months after the wedding, Lady Seren returned. She came with a petition, a formal challenge to the legitimacy of the marriage, backed by 3 noble houses and a legal argument that hinged on Elsinore's lack of recognized lineage. It was clever, it was ruthless, and it was delivered in open court in front of 200 witnesses, with the precision of someone who had been planning this for nearly a year. Cale's response was immediate and volcanic. He rose from the throne with a fury that made the air in the room crack, his dominance aura flooding the chamber so violently that half the court dropped to their knees involuntarily. The words that came out of his mouth were calculated, surgical, designed to annihilate the petition and everyone attached to it. "I never should have married you," he said, turning to Elsinore. The court gasped. He held her gaze. "I should have mated you the moment you caught Seren's wrist in this very hall and lied to her face about it. I should have claimed you the first night you sat in my study and told me a story about a healer who threw a bedpan at a duke. I should have bonded with you the morning I woke up and realized I could not remember what peace felt like before you. I never should have married you, Elsinore, because marriage is a contract. And what you are to me is so far beyond a contract that the word is an insult." He turned back to the court, to Seren, to the noble houses behind the challenge. "The petition is denied," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "And if anyone in this room wishes to question the legitimacy of my queen again, they are welcome to take it up with me personally." Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Elsinore stood beside the throne, the ring on her finger catching the torchlight, and smiled. Not a broken smile, not a bitter smile. The smile of a woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated and had finally, irrevocably, found the place where she belonged.